welcome to our session on European values, identity, and politics. I'm Robert Guest, I'm the foreign editor of The Economist. I'm moderating this session, and we have a wonderful lineup here. We have Douglas Alexander here, who, among his many accomplishments, is doing a Radio 4 series about belonging in Europe. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is currently working on a book about women and migration in Europe. We have Gemma Mortensen, who runs the More in Common Foundation, which was set up after the murder of Joe Cox MP to try to seek common ground. And Douglas Murray, who, contrary to what I think one of the slides said earlier, is in fact the author of The Strange Death of Europe. So we're going to go straight into questions, and straight into talking. And I'm going to start with Douglas Alexander. What do you mean by belonging?
Well, I spent 2 decades involved in British politics, and the defining questions of British public life at the time were questions of income and expenditure. Did you want a larger state and higher taxes? Did you want a smaller state and lower taxes? And yet the dominating questions of our public life today are questions of belonging. Do we feel British or do we feel Europe? The Brexit debate. Do we feel Scottish or British? Is it possible to feel Scottish, British, and European? In the United States, can you be a Mexican or a Muslim, or can you have to be an American firster? So in that sense, I asked myself, what is it that explains that shift from a politics rooted in ideology to a politics rooted in identity? And I traveled around Britain and I talked to a very wide range of people. And essentially, what I heard were 2 points. Firstly, that for most people, a sense of belonging, a sense of home, is intimately associated with a sense of security. And on the other hand, belonging relies on the telling and the sharing of shared stories. And actually, as I try and make sense of why we've seen this shift in the tectonic plates of politics across the West, I think you have to look back to the financial crisis. Essentially, it trashed the public's confidence in the powerful, so it undermined the conventional storytellers of the time, at the same time as it heightened people's economic insecurity. And into that vacuum have stepped new storytellers and new stories to try and make sense of the world as it exists today. And I think that helps explain some of the changes that we're seeing in contemporary European politics.
Okay. Storytelling. Ayaan, I mean, you bring a sort of personal perspective to this. You were born in Somalia, one of the most violent countries in the world. You came to Europe, had to leave Europe because of death threats after you stopped being a Muslim and said so. Now live in America, and you're thinking about the effects that migration have on the way life is lived for women in Europe. What does your story tell us about that? What are you finding?
Well, I think what I'd like to add to what Douglas says is, if you think in terms of belonging, you know, there's the ideology and identity. I'm trying to choose my words very, very carefully here. When I came to Europe and I learned the language and I found a job, I had this immediate sense of economic belonging. But I didn't belong in terms of storytelling. I didn't belong in terms of religion, culture, and so on. Over time, of course, I adapted. I came to understand. I lived in Holland, so I came to understand what it was that made the Dutch tick. And I adopted some of those very basic, let me put it this way, the idea that maybe we don't have the same origins, but we may have the same destiny. I liked what I found, and I wanted to belong to it, but it was a conscious choice. And the conflict that I see in Europe today is the host nations and the elites of the host nations, when they discuss immigration, they're very comfortable talking about economic belonging. Let's have these people come in and, let them get a job, let them learn the language. But then when it comes to all the other intangible parts of belonging, which I think are more profound, we put a taboo on that. And as we were sitting, preparing for this talk, I was saying to you, thankfully, I don't suffer from, I'm completely indifferent to accusations of being xenophobic, racist, Islamophobic. You can diagnose me with all of that stuff, but I tune that out. And I really would like us to have a conversation about the cultural elements of belonging, the intangibles, the stories.
The intangibles. So, I mean, I recall from your Dutch experience, right. You worked as an interpreter for a while, yeah. Interpreting from Somali to Dutch, and dealt with some of the misunderstandings, I suppose, or gulfs in understanding. One story springs to mind was the time when, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, there was a Somali boy in a Dutch school yes. who was getting into fights in the playground and beating up, another child. Yes. And the teachers called him in, called in the parents and said, someone was rude to your son and he beat the crap out of them. And what the teachers meant was this is terrible behavior and it must change. And the parents were incredibly proud of him and said, yeah, excellent. Someone insulted him. He beat them up. Brilliant. Yes. And so the job of interpretation meant that you actually had to say rather more than yes. the teachers were saying.
I had to say rather more than just the words. And I had at some point to ask for permission, may I please culturally interpret not just the words from Somali to Dutch and Dutch to Somali, and explain to them the context that if you are living in Somalia, when I was a little girl, my mother would send me, if I was hit by a child, she would send me back and say, you've got to hit twice as hard. So I learned to bite, I learned to scratch. I would braid my hair and put thorns in them, anticipating that girls would come and fight with me. And when they tried to pull my hair, they would have their hands in thorns. I don't want to say this is our culture. I want to say it's our context. It's the context of survival. And after the civil war started, you have now, the civil war in Somalia started in 1991. So you have children who were born in 1991 who know nothing other than their way of survival is to engage in violence. Now, when you get masses and masses of people from Somalia, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, places where violence is the norm, number one. Number two, where women are commoditized, and so on. And they come to Europe, Britain, France, Germany, United States, etc. I think it is almost criminal to then put a taboo on that reality. And what's been going wrong with Europe for the last 3-4 decades is to say, let's just talk about the material. Let's just talk about the economic integration, but let's completely ignore all the cultural aspect, the context out of which people come and the context into which they come. Mm-hmm. And if we don't talk about that, I think we're destroying Europe and we're holding a false promise to those who hope to come to Europe in search of a better life.
So if we're talking about, how the people who come here from very different cultures and the people who already live here are going to get on better, where does the responsibility lie? How much of it is on the newcomers? How much of it is on the people who are already here?
Would you like that answer from me?
I was actually going to ask Gemma that, I think, but if you want to disagree with her as soon as she's answered it, that would be fine.
I'm absolutely happy to agree or disagree, but yeah, let's not, as long as we don't have any taboos.
No, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what you said, and to the question of who bears the responsibility, I think we need to realise that we're entering into a time in our societies, particularly in Western democracies. I think there's an existential threat to the liberal democracies in which we live, and if we want to preserve them and preserve the many things that we have enjoyed and our parents have enjoyed, then we need to work hard. We can't take it for granted. And that means everybody living in our societies, either incumbent or newcomer, needs to commit to increasing the extent of the social glue, digging deeper into understanding who each of us are and what it takes to hold together. And I think there is also the necessity of realizing that there are extremes at both sides. And what much of the More in Common research shows that we've done of late is that there's a majority actually in each of the countries that we've studied, which is France, Germany, United States, and Italy, that you have a majority, which we're calling the exhausted majority, who doesn't feel represented in the mainstream political discourse, certainly not on social media, that there's a tribalization of the political extremes. And actually, people in the middle have what may feel like contradictory feelings about what's going on in the world. On the one hand, there is a feeling of a great degree of care, compassion, human response to what's happening to people who are less well off, less fortunate, well privileged, whether those are the poorer people in society or whether that's immigrants or refugees, for example. But there's also deep fears and concerns. What's my place in this future that you tell me about? What's my place in this picture of a ever-globalizing world where the rich get richer and we get forgotten? What's my place when I see that other people are, in my own perception, are given preference to me and my family when it comes to the things that I need and I have been promised and have been the things that I could count on in previous generations? And at our peril, we ignore that, I think. And that is not a reactionary thing to consider and look at. I think it is an absolute necessity if we're going to get through what will be the next few decades of rupture, the likes of which we have never, ever seen before on almost every indicator. The way in which the More in Common research has been done is it says, well, it really does ask the deep question of what's happening. And it says that any of the explanators that are normally given, economics or immigration or in-group, out-group tribes, none of these on their own are sufficient to explain what's going on. They take leave of an American academic, I imagine there's quite a few Americans in the audience, called Jonathan Haidt. I don't know how many of you are familiar with moral foundation theory, but it's really interesting because it says that everybody draws on 5 pillars of morality in their life. So on the left, people typically on the left draw on 2 things: care. You see somebody who's in plight, you respond to that emotionally. Fairness, so are people treated equally, or is there just desserts? And then typically those that are not accessed by people on the left, but are also accessed by people on the right, who also have the moral properties of care and fairness, are loyalty. I think that it is a prerequisite for a good society that people, my family, my community, my group are looked after. Authority. It is necessary for my sense of security and stability that there are institutions that protect me and keep me safe and keep this world one that I can manage. And purity, there are some things which are just beyond the pale. It's a kind of rooted in an evolutionary idea of disgust. And I think what we have at the moment is we have competing stories, to Douglas's point, of the world, which either are only told in terms of care and fairness, or only told in terms of loyalty and authority and purity disgust. And what we need to find is the story that covers all of those.
Can you give me an example of that?
So I think what we typically describe as well. I think there's the word populism, I think, has become loose, and I would prefer to narrow it down to what we describe as nativist, which is the deliberate use of using racial or fractures around faith to trigger in-group, out-group kind of tribal identities. I think what we're seeing in a lot of Western democracies at the moment is an increased sense of threat, which in social psychology terms makes you retreat into a much more smaller group of who your people are, your group are. And that's very dangerous because that doesn't reflect the modern world. All of the challenges that we face require us to come together in some form of a way to combat climate change or inequality, anything that you care about. So I think what nativists have been very good at is saying the elites don't care about you. They're not loyal to you. They have completely screwed you over, which, it has to be said, in many cases is true. They can say that look at these systems that are meant to protect you, the immigration system, who is in control. The politicians, not only do they not care about you, but they are completely incapable through the institutions that exist of securing your interests. And then the thing which we see a lot in just the pre-election kind of periods is a deliberate spreading of stories, particularly through social media, which really trigger that moral foundation of purity. So, for example, stories that we saw in Germany about kids not being able to eat pork sausages, or diseases being spread by migrants coming over the borders, etc. Now, I'm not saying that it is. I think one of the problems at the moment is that there is not enough space to have hard and honest conversations about how people are feeling and what are the cultural consequences of societies in which there are people from many cultures. I think that's something that this country in particular has been ill-equipped at, frankly. But we also have to be very much on our guard against a tiny minority of each of the populations in Western democracies that are deliberately exploiting what I think is quite a sophisticated read of our hidden moral architecture to trigger us into a much more narrow definition of ourselves than may otherwise be the case.
I mean, one of the principal findings of your most recent study was that there's a very large middle ground of people who are quite reasonable, quite open to compromise, and very quiet.
Yeah.
They're not making much noise, but presumably because they exist, there is the possibility that they could vote, and that in various countries you could find moderate parties winning. I want to move it over to bring in Douglas Murray, who's been sitting very patiently there. We have Paris is burning, Sweden can't form a government, Denmark is thinking of putting unwanted immigrants on a small island. Are we witnessing the strange death of Europe? If so, why is it dying, and how can it be prevented from dying?
Well, I say there are two principal reasons. One is that Europe is changing very significantly in its demographic. It's not obvious to me at all that you massively change a population and the population remains of the same ilk as the people who previously lived there. We have this thing in London all the time that, if anything bad happens here, people say, well, London has displayed Blitz spirit. Blitz spirit doesn't come in the water. And actually, I think whenever there has been something in recent years, they don't show Blitz spirit. It wasn't Blitz spirit on Oxford Street this time last year when there was a rumour that there was a terrorist attack going on. Started because two guys started rowing on a tube station at Oxford's tube stop, and there was a stampede all the way down Oxford Street, people flinging themselves in stores, barricading themselves in changing rooms. That wasn't Blitz spirit. It was panic. Because people don't just imbibe things because they live in a new place. And we've been incredibly reckless in our presumption to the contrary. So the first thing is populations are changing very significantly, and that's the case all across Western Europe. And the second thing is Europe's inability or lack of desire to believe in itself or to know what it's for. And there are various answers that are going around on this at the moment. The political left, by and large, has an answer to this vacuum that consists of embedding a new metaphysics in Europe, roughly along the lines of minority rights, gay marriage, women's rights, racial minority rights, anti-racism, all good things, but not, I would suggest, a very good basis for foundational principles of a society. These are good products of liberal democracy, but they're very, very bad foundations. The political right, by contrast, has a big problem. The left everywhere always wants the same thing. Equality, equity, justice, and so on. But most people on the political right, or let's say conservatives, want to preserve what they have. And I mean, I'm in a different European country most weeks still, and one of the things you can't help noticing everywhere is that everyone is preserving something different. Austrians are preserving something different from Germans, who are preserving something very different from the French, who are preserving something very different from people here, and all across Europe. As we know, I mean, it's unbelievably diverse and richly diverse continent already. So when you say we need to conserve, it's not that easy because it shifts, as I say, from country to country. And I would just say that there's one thing in particular which is a very, very bad sign already. I mean, there's quite a lot of bad signs, but let me give you one. we found it incredibly difficult to just establish the most basic norms. So,
Do we?
yeah. Let me give an example. I mean, a metaphor I'm sort of fond of on this is if I moved to another country, let's say I moved to France, and obviously I said, okay, I'm going to drive in France, and I want to bring my car from Britain. And you're like, okay, maybe he's just attached to his car, sort of eccentric British guy. And I just prefer the wheel on this side. Now, the moment that I try not just to bring my car with its steering wheel on the right-hand side, but also insist on continuing to drive the wrong way down the road, is the point when the state needs to say, absolutely not. You do not get to carve out your own road policy. And the oddity of European integration strategies in recent years has been that there was a period where people were allowed to carve out their own strategies, their own ways of living. And so we had this confusion that has evolved from, as Angela Merkel said in the Potsdam speech in 2010, we didn't expect people to stay. Then we did realize they were staying, and we decided they could pursue whatever life, broadly speaking, they wanted to pursue and have their own culture. And then in the last 15 or so years we said, actually, no, we want you to become like us. We want you to integrate. These are three totally different things, and I blame no migrant for being confused about that, because we were confused.
But the analogy you use of driving on the wrong side of the road, I mean, nobody does that. The penalty for doing that is death. Whereas, you know, if the question is of sort of cultural norms and how you behave, you know, I mean, there are some things that we think is fine. If you wish to cook food that smells different, most people think that's okay. Some people don't think it's okay. If you wish to conduct honour killings in the United Kingdom, you're not allowed to. Douglas, you wanted to
I offer
jump in.
a rather more confident perspective. We're gathered here in London. The essence of London historically has not been ethnic purity, but pluralism. It was the designated capital of what was first a Celtic nation, and the choice of capital was decided by Romans who came from Italy. You know, you look at the great cathedrals of England, and they were overseen by Norman bishops. Look at Richard the Lionheart outside Parliament, just across the bridge, the very embodiment of English fighting spirit. He spoke French, and he secured his release when Jewish citizens of the country at the time put up the money to be able to allow him to be released as a hostage. So there is a long heritage, not just in Britain, but in Europe, of pluralism as much as purity being our hallmark. But then look at more modern history. It was, 70 years ago that just down the river from here, at Tilbury Docks, the Windrush landed, bringing the first significant wave of Afro-Caribbean migration after the Second World War. Now, there were tough times in the decades that followed. Remember, it was 50 years ago when Enoch Powell declared his infamous Rivers of Blood speech. At that time, there was a profound pessimism as to the capacity of people in the United Kingdom to live together in harmony. And yet I believe, overwhelmingly, that group that Gemma spoke of do now see citizens as being of equal worth and wanting to live in a genuinely inclusive society. So as I try and make sense of what's happened in Europe, of course we need to understand the cultural anxiety that people feel about the world changing round about them, but we also need to recognize the economic drivers of the anger and indignation that people feel at the moment. If people feel left out and left behind by an economy that isn't working for them, then whatever integration strategy you have is not itself going to be adequate to give people a fundamental sense that we're all in this together. And actually, if we have the levels of inequality that we're observing at the moment, it's very difficult to feel that people genuinely have a shared stake and a shared interest in our common life. And in that sense, I'm more optimistic, I have to say, than the accounts that we've heard, that we can find ways of transcending difference and live in harmony together.
But I don't think that it has to do now with sitting here and saying, I'm optimistic or I'm pessimistic, whatever our attitude is, optimism or pessimism. And I think all four of us here, maybe all five of us here, are in fact optimistic. But the optimism will only be justified if we actually really start talking about what the issues are. Yes, in the past, and I don't think when Douglas was talking, Douglas Murray, I didn't hear him say anything against pessimism or against, ethnic purity. I don't think he's arguing for ethnic purity. I think what Douglas is saying, what we are all saying is, in order to maintain this heterogeneous and pluralistic society, those of us who are either excluded on economic grounds or who are from elsewhere, have crossed borders and come here, we have to initiate them into what is here and what is the best about this place. And to do that, we have to have an honest discussion about what it is that you need to discard. Yes, if you drive your car in the opposite direction, yeah, it's a death sentence. But what if you stand in a mosque and you call for the death of all infidels and apostates? What if you say, I'm going to establish a law that is going to completely segregate women, introduce polygamy? In most European countries, with considerable populations from Muslim-majority countries, these are some of the trends that we are seeing. We are seeing an assault on free speech, an assault on free press, an assault on the rule of law. And what is it that we should do, and what is it that we can do to impress upon these newcomers that we do things differently, as did the teacher. When she talked to the parent, you opened with that scene where I was translating, and the Dutch teacher told the Somali parents as gently as she possibly could, if you want your child to get ahead in Holland, you've got to convince him not to hit other children. Aggression doesn't pay here. If you imbibe if you tell your child, go knock them out, he's going to be put in some kind of special school, and he's not going to get ahead. He's going to drop out. So how can we have these honest, compassionate conversations without virtue signaling?
Okay. I'm going to
Very briefly.
I'm going to call on you to answer, but as soon as he's finished, I'm going to take questions from the audience. So if you can think of what you're going to ask and put your hand up afterwards, that'd be great. Douglas.
Very quickly, I think it's very important always to avoid a sort of competition to see who can be more optimistic. There's no innate reason why being optimistic is a good thing. It's not like you can win if you're really optimistic, as opposed to somebody who's moderately optimistic. But let me get on to the facts. So you mentioned quite rightly, Douglas, the changes that have always happened. And this is what I call the ship of Theseus issue. As you'll know, the old issue of the ship of Theseus, that it changes over time. You have to put things into it to keep it. Over time, you've put so many things to change it that it's not still the ship that Theseus set out on, but it is still the ship of Theseus. Now, as a society, what you want is you allow things to move, you allow things to add on, but you want to have the recognizable vessel that you originally had, normally, unless you want to totally destroy it and start from scratch or something like that, in which case say so. But the specific examples you give, the Norman invasion was, until the 20th century, the most significant act that had happened in these islands. And the Norman invasion is thought to have altered the population of the UK by around 4 to 5%. Okay. By the 2011 census, it was published in 2012, 23 out of 33 London boroughs had people who identified on the census as white British as a minority. So we moved from this thing of, yes, people have always shifted, they've always changed, to, gosh, in a generation, people in London who identify as white British, the census's term, not mine, are a minority. Well, if you say, things have always changed, it was always like that, look at the Normans, look at the Romans, what are you moaning about? Fantastic way to further disenfranchise the public. Okay. To say it's always been like this, it hasn't. The speed and the nature of this immigration is very different.
Who in the audience would like to ask a question? If you can raise your hand, I will recognize you, and if you can ask a question, not make a speech, that would be great. Yes, gentleman over there. Can I address it to anyone or all?
Just to the panel as a whole. It raised this issue of I haven't seen any research that says what is the rate at which society can accommodate change. So I'm a great believer in kind of liberalism, progressivism, but can you do too much to create these tensions? And I haven't seen, in all the reading I've done, I haven't seen research that says, actually, this is the rate at which a society can change and evolve without tripping itself up.
Well,
what could you do to improve that rate of change?
Well, I mean, one thing you could do, you could look at Australia and Canada, which would be the two places which have the highest proportion of foreign-born people in their population, and they're two of the nicest, most peaceful, prosperous places in the world. But Douglas, you wanted to say, and possibly
Firstly,
Gemma.
a point of agreement between the two Douglases on the panel. I don't think there's a virtue in optimism. Equally, there's no great virtue in pessimism. Why am I moderately optimistic when I try and answer your question? Because actually, those London boroughs that Douglas describes have some of the most integrated attitudes towards immigration. One of the great paradoxes that we've seen is those areas with lower levels of immigration very often have higher levels of antipathy towards inward migration.
You know why?
Than those communities. Let me finish the sentence and then you can answer. And in that sense, in many of those cities where you see high levels of inward migration, people create habits of shared citizenship. They discover that their sense of being white British isn't undermined by living next to somebody who prays differently or eats different foods, although incidentally, the most popular British dish today is chicken tikka masala. So in that sense, of course, there is an economic dimension to the fact that even though we've got great inequality in London, most people in London have a sense as part of the great city that they are part of the future and the economy that is becoming. And actually, one of the great divergences that we've seen in Europe over recent years is not just a divergence between the educated and manual workers, but also between booming cities and broken provincial towns. And that's why, again, I'm not in any way undermining the importance of those tough and honest conversations and sharing those habits of cultural integration. But I think it would be naive to weight the conversation in the direction of immigration to the exclusion of the structural changes in the economy, which is causing, for example, the provincial towns of Britain to diverge so rapidly from the international city in which we're sitting today.
Gemma, you want to say something then, Douglas?
I think that's an excellent question, one I've asked myself a lot, and I have two responses to it. One is that I think the pace of change, regardless of what society can bear, is going to outstrip it anyway. So in some ways it's a redundant question, and therefore our ability is how do we mitigate it? The other is a piece of work that we've drawn on a lot by this fascinating academic called Karen Stenner, and she's developed something called the authoritarian dynamic. What that shows is that in every population, she estimates approximately 30% of people who have a latent tendency towards authoritarianism, where that is triggered into actually being expressed in your behavior by a sense of threat and the pace of change. So what we're seeing in today's world, given its complexity and the rate at which things are changing, is people who would not otherwise be activated, responding to their external environment, whether that's the economy or demographic, it could be a very number of factors, and feeling a much greater disposition towards authoritarianism. That could be feeling like you need a very strong ruler that's going to break the rules, looking for political parties that break apart the system, etc. So I do think it is a responsibility for us to ask the question, what does it take not to heighten people's sense of threat, but to do that in a way which is fair and just and does protect the diversity in the societies that we love and is part of us. And that is going to be, I think, one of the staple pieces of public and political debate in the next 10, 20 years. It's incredibly important.
Douglas.
I agree. Very quickly to shoot down the point the other Douglas made. The reason why the polls show that is...
It's a Dogeatdog world, isn't it?
I loathe all abbreviations of our name.
On that, we agree completely.
Yeah. I had to warn Australian audiences in the summer not to go with Duggo. The reason why it's wrong is because the polling that shows this, which politicians in particular much like citing, suggests that the British people, and indeed other publics across Europe, who are not suitably in favour of mass immigration and so on, just haven't had enough of it. The problem is the polls show something quite different, which is that the areas which you're talking about in, for instance, London, are going to be a self-selective group, aren't they? Because a lot of people had the diversity, didn't like it, left. So that's why, in poll after poll, yes, if you live in a very diverse area, the likelihood is that you are at least beige about it, if not enthusiastic, because the other people moved out. And that's one of the causes of the bifurcation between London and the rest of the country that's replicated in every other country. Secondly, very quickly, those of us who enjoy these sorts of liberal paradoxes that are thrown up by this collect examples of where the rubber hits the road here. And let me give you one. So it's meant to be the idea that migrants come into the society, we inculcate a sort of sense of liberal values into them, and we've sort of agreed, as I said at the outset, what those liberal values might be. Now, everywhere you can poll, for instance, attitudes in the nation about minority sexual rights, gay marriage, for instance. There was a poll a couple of years ago I cite in my book, support for gay marriage, opposition to gay marriage. You would have thought this would smoke out some homophobes in Wales, or rural Yorkshire, or Cornwall. No. Nationally, rural areas and everywhere else, about 14% of the public were absolutely opposed on moral grounds to gay marriage. Well, what was the result in lovely, diverse London? Double that. Twice the number from the rest of the country were opposed to gay marriage in the UK. Why is it? How could this be? But we thought we were so diverse and liberal. Maybe these things all rub against each other in ways which we haven't yet even imagined.
Just to come in there, because I think I have to dispute this idea that the only reason why you would be beige, as you put it, towards people of difference is because all the people who dislike that have left. So the whole field of social science, of social contact theory, proves beyond a doubt that if I have genuine interaction with somebody who is different from me in a certain way over time, I come to know you better, I realize what we have in common, and my attitudes generally shift. So in our research in Italy, we found out that people who had proper, strong relationships or friendships, acquaintances with people, with Muslims, were twice as likely to see that they shared values, that they had things in common. So I think we've got to do both things. We've got to recognize that, London is this incredible anomaly within this country, but we've also got to understand that as a society, and this is not just in the UK, this is in other European countries, we are becoming separated from each other on every single axis, the type of work we do, where we've been educated, where we live, whether that's urban or rural, our faith, our race, and this is not healthy for a society. And there has to be a major, major investment on every aspect of policy at reconnecting us as human beings and across those lines of difference. And that's not something that a magical, political wand can get waved at. That's about schooling, it's about housing, and it's about really reimagining our societies in a way that Douglas talks to the necessity of storytelling. And, you say when you talk about the fundamental values, we need to be much better at finding and articulating.
Can we bring in another question from the audience, please? Raise your hand if you would like to quiz one of the panelists on something. Yes. Can you wait for the microphone, please? Thank you.
Hi, I'm from the United States. When Trump first mentioned the wall, it was just an absolute fantasy, and everyone thought it was crazy. And slowly, none of the red Trump supporters are converting to blue, and slowly the blues are just kind of accepting we're going to have another 4 years. What advice, or what do you see that walls for America, like from what you've seen in Europe, and what do you think that walls do to this social interaction that we're talking about? Because the United States is all about, do we build a wall or we don't build a wall? That's what the conversation's about.
Ayaan, perhaps you live in California?
I live in California, which is solidly blue. I will say, just listening to my European friends here, I think that one thing, if you want to challenge Donald Trump and you want to change things, you have to hear, you've got to put your ear to what it is that he heard and he seems to hear, which is there's this enormous chasm, there's a huge gap between what's perceived as Washington and Washington elites, maybe Silicon Valley elites, and how real people live. And I think Europe has been getting that wrong. I want to point out to a moment during the 2016 elections when Hillary Clinton, someone asked her, who are these people who are voting for Trump? And then she said, oh, well, there's a basket of homophobics, Islamophobics, xenophobes. She started to diagnose what could have been her voters with all sorts of phobias. And I think that as long as the Democrats, or the elites as they are perceived to be, continue to hold this attitude, not only Trump, but people who could potentially be worse than Trump could win. I didn't want to answer the study. This gentleman asked, I haven't seen a study. All the studies I have seen in the last 15 years in Europe and in the United States were studies that I feel were dishonest and doctored. And we need to look back into that data, and that is why we're getting things wrong, because it's all about confirmation bias. Do we really, really want to understand what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the United States of America? We have to reflect on the pluses and minuses of globalization. I'm a beneficiary of globalization. I want it to continue. I think human beings around the globe can get together. But you have to look at the people who are bearing the burden of that globalization. It's usually the poorest people in rich countries who are hurt the most by immigration. And unless we recognize that, they are going to have to listen to the siren songs of populists. What does it do to women? Look, I think it is completely and utterly shameful that in 1945 we said never again. And look at the Jewish minorities all over Europe who are living where there are significant minorities from Muslim majority countries. We have to change our language, the way we talk about it. I'm listening to the people sitting on either side of me and I'm thinking, goodness me, you haven't learned anything. We've got to be really explicit. What we learned from George Orwell was speak in words that are just for 4 letters, 5 letters long, explicit, straightforward. Yes, the world is getting closer together. People are coming from countries with completely different cultures, religions, priorities. We have encounters, and some of those encounters are good, and they have been good, and the people in this room have benefited, but we cannot turn away from the people who didn't.
I mean, there are quite a lot of examples of people who have spoken plainly and who have figured out.
But then they've been dismissed as being racist, xenophobic, you name it.
Okay.
All the decent people, the people I think of as decent, serious, solid members of the establishment are absolutely terrified of taking on these identity issues. They just don't want to do it, and I don't blame them. And when I talk about those people, I'm talking about immigrants. I'm talking some of the famous names in Germany, in Sweden, in the Netherlands. They're from Pakistan, they're from Iran, they're from Somalia. They're not going to get into that because they think, whoa, I don't want to be threatened by the Islamists. I don't want to be dismissed as a turncoat, or what was it they call me, a bounty, or Uncle Tom. I've even been called a Nazi. So it's...
Just to pick up on Ayaan's point, I was in Germany again the other day, and I was speaking at a conference, and I had Hamid Abdel Samid, Ayaan will know, a prominent ex-Muslim in Germany. I knew he was coming in. I hadn't seen him for a bit because it was as if the Chancellor would come in, the amount of security he needs. Yeah. The amazing woman who's the imam of the first progressive liberal female-run mosque in Germany came in to join me a bit later. And again, I thought maybe it's Chancellor Merkel because the amount of security that accompanies her. Yeah. And it's not because of AfD supporters. I mean, goodness knows, maybe it could be down the road. But it's not because of that. It's because the German government decided to do something absolutely insane in 2015. And I just very quickly wanted to say something about this. When I was traveling around all the places, not only countries that people were fleeing from in that time, but the places they were coming in, I realized that we had, this goes back to one of the points you made earlier, the fundamental problem about understanding how to think about this. We were thinking about it in terms of, let me say, mercy, the virtue of mercy to anyone in the world who wanted to make it to Europe. And mercy is a very fine emotion, but justice also matters. And Aristotle says somewhere that when you have two things that strong, working in contradistinction to each other, it may be that you're misunderstanding one of the virtues. And we have been misunderstanding the virtue of justice, which includes justice for people here, not just justice for everyone around the world. A very quick other point. The whole business of walls relies, like the optimism-pessimism thing, on something being built in to the discussion before you've even started it. And that is something along the lines of Europe in recent decades, which we all know the virtues of, but it goes something like, build bridges, not walls. And we've been running on these exhausted 1968 motifs for too long, because it's just not a decision between bridges and walls. If you walk across Westminster Bridge, you'll discover that Westminster Bridge is covered in walls. It's covered in walls to stop people driving trucks into the population. So it's not an either-or thing. And we've got to stop the political debate pretending that it is.
I'm going to come to Douglas. We're going to have time probably for one more question. So if you can raise your hand and we get a microphone to you so you're ready for after Douglas has spoken. Is there a hand somewhere? There's one there. Yeah. Do we get the microphone there? But Douglas first,
Let me
please.
try and answer the lady's question, but just firstly, let me return the compliment to Douglas. The main reason people are leaving London is not because they don't like their neighbours, it's because they can't afford a house. And in that sense, economics is driving significant change in London. And in terms of walls, we also need to understand what's the interaction of culture and of economics. If Donald Trump was serious about building a wall to protect the jobs of Middle America, with the greatest respect to Ayaan, he'd build a wall around Stanford, or certainly build a wall between California and the rest of the country. Because that's where the robots are coming from. And in that sense, robots are going to take far more jobs in Middle America than Mexicans or people from the southern border. The reality as to why he is making such a deal
But Douglas,
of
just
the
on
border,
that point, Douglas, on that point, if then robots are taking, that's exactly what's happening, then how can he explain that he's going to bring in low-skilled people from countries that have a surplus of low-skilled labor? So how can you explain to the American in Ohio, Wisconsin, all of these middle country places, that your jobs will be taken by robots and by low-skilled immigrants?
That's not the question. Just let me finish. That's not the question Donald Trump's trying to answer.
He's not trying to answer
He's not offering a better tomorrow. He's actually offering a better yesterday. What was the winning phrase of his campaign?
He just wants to
Make
win.
America great again. The key word is again, because actually what he's saying is, I will take you back, in the case of most of those Ohio workers, to probably the mid-1980s. When actually
we have
you were
3 minutes
economically and
left.
culturally
I would like to
relatively
take that
secure.
last question, and can you make it swift, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll be brief. Many of the countries in Western Europe are suffering from low rates of growth, low productivity growth, stagnation, and there's a shortage of skilled labor as well as even unskilled labor in many of the marketplaces. What's wrong with the analysis that says that migration, with all of the obvious pitfalls and challenges, is also the obvious solution to at least part of that problem?
Okay, we give 1 minute to Gemma and 1 minute to Doug.
David Brooks, the famous American columnist, wrote an excellent column the other day which said it's not the economy stupid, it's relationships, relationships, relationships. And I think there's something very dangerous about any side only looking at the economics of this. It is true that there is going to be massive disruption from automation. And it is also true that when the robots take jobs, and even if we put a ban on all immigration, which is never going to happen, that people would still feel a massive feel of threat and danger about the future. Now, what the More in Common research shows is that people are humanitarian. They look out and they see people from other countries and the plight that they are in. They believe in the principle of asylum. They believe that we have a responsibility to help across Europe, but they are also asking fair and legitimate questions about how do we build societies in these times of change where we can get the skilled labor that we need, where we can make sure that we look after our kids, everybody in the country, no matter where they're from or what culture or background, that we can make sure that we get through these times of rupture and dislocation alone and together. And coming back to the point of optimism or pessimism, I don't care about either. What I care about is that we have to enable a new generation of leadership to come and say, there is a possible way, it is viable economically, but it also speaks to where people are feeling, where they do get that sense of belonging, as Douglas says, and we need to pay attention to that, which is not currently in our lexicon of politics and economics, frankly. So that's the challenge for us now.
Doug, 1 minute.
I entirely agree. I believe in asylum, which is why I believe that you don't open the borders and then pretend that that was an orderly asylum policy. After 2016, the Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, admitted that at least 60% of the arrivals in Europe from 2015 to 16 had, quote, no more right to be in Europe than anyone else in the rest of the world. So these are very, very bad policy decisions that have been made at a very high level. And my own view is that the asylum component is going to suffer magnificently and tragically from precisely that equation of the two things that's been going on in recent years. Very quickly, the gentleman asked about there has been a motif I write about in one of the opening chapters of my book of various reasons that people give in retrospect for decisions that would have happened anyway. And one of them is that the migrants can come and do these jobs, and because we're aging, for instance. It always ignores the extraordinary fact that migrants get old as well. And it's this sort of strange short-term justification for something that's going to happen anyway. And by the way, there are countries in Europe like Sweden that added 2 to 3% to its population in 2015 to 16. The only thing that Sweden needs less than more unskilled labor is unskilled labor that doesn't speak Swedish. It's cruel. It's cruel to the people who can't come. It's cruel to the people in Sweden. And it's a magnificently awful way to set up a future for your society, because we have consistently, and I'll finish on this point, we have consistently in Europe underestimated the number of people who want to come here and massively overestimated our ability to integrate them. And between those two misunderstandings lie all of the problems that we've been talking about today, and many more that we could issue and address in years to come.
Well, one could add to that that the Swedes had a policy of not letting the asylum seekers work for a very long time, which was probably not brilliant for integration. But well, clearly this debate could last for a very long time, and we're out of it. So I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. That's Douglas Alexander, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Gemma Mortensen, and Douglas Murray. Thank you. Thanks very much.